Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my video review of the Sony FE 16-35mm F2.8 G Master, and this is the second generation or Mark II of that lens. Now, the original 16-35 f2.8 GM was released in 2017, where it completed the trinity of fast professional grade zooms, along with the 24-70 and 70-200mm f2.8 zoom lenses. In the years that have passed, however, Sony's ability to really design and execute lenses has dramatically improved. And so they are in the process of updating some of their earlier GM lenses, which includes this trinity. In 2021, they released the 70-200 G Master Mark II lens, the 24-70 in 2022, and then in 2023, the 16-35mm. So Sony has had a few goals with these updated versions of their lenses, and they can be summed up, I think, basically in four parts. They are to be smaller and lighter, they are to be more feature-rich, they are to have better autofocus, and they're also to have better image quality. I believe that Sony has achieved all of those objectives with the new 16-35mm f2.8 G Master Mark II, but all of that, of course, comes at a price. The lens retails at nearly $2,300 US. So the question is it worth it? Well, that's what we're going to explore right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Fantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Fantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
So to give you an idea of how the review is going to work, I'm going to give you a breakdown of the build and handling, of the autofocus and video performance. I'll give you an overview of the image quality, and then after my summation, if you want a deep dive into the optical performance, you can jump right into that. It will come at the end of the video, or you can jump ahead via the timestamps below. Now, when it comes to the build and design, as noted, this lens is smaller and lighter than its predecessor. It's 87.8 millimeters in diameter, 3.5 inches, and it is 111.5 millimeters in overall length. That's 4.4 inches. So while the diameter is the same, it is a full 10 millimeters shorter than the previous generation lens, and that definitely affects the overall weight. This weighs in at 547 grams or 1.2 pounds, which is 133 grams lighter than the previous generation lens. And to give you some perspective, Canon's RF 15-28 millimeter f2.8 weighs in at 840 grams. And so we're talking about, nearly 300 grams more heavy than what this lens is. You're really going to notice that out in the field. We retain an 82 millimeter front filter thread, and it comes with a very slim design lens hood as well. This is a thoroughly weather sealed lens. Weather sealing has improved with some additional seal points. I count 15 different sealed gaskets in here, plus a fluorine coating on the front element. In addition, when it comes to the feature side of things, is that we now have an aperture ring with all the various GM ways of controlling that. And so you can use it clicked, you can use it declicked with a switch down on the right side of the barrel, and you also have an iris lock here on the left side that will either lock you in or out of the aperture ring if you're not a fan of using a manual aperture ring. I do like the precision where you can choose either the 1/3 stop clicks that are very, very well defined, but the moment you switch it into the declicked version, all of a sudden those go right away and you can very smoothly rack through it for video purposes. They have added an additional focus hold button to the design, so there's now one on the top of the barrel, so if you're shooting in a vertical orientation, there's one handy there. The original position is also retained along with the AF/MF switch that was there. You will find that when you zoom, the zoom action is very, very nicely damped and it's very smooth. But you'll see that there is just a little bit of a zooming out actually at the 16mm point in the zoom range, and it is fully retracted at 35mm. And so at 16mm, the extension by my measurement is only about 8mm. It's very slight enough that I think you can throw it on a gimbal and you can go throughout the zoom range without the balance changing, and so that you can continue to use it without having to recalibrate. Now, another significant improvement here is that the minimum focus distance has been reduced down to just a hair over 22 centimeters, and that gives you now a 0.32 times magnification at 35mm. That's versus the 0.19 times magnification on the previous generation lens. So as you can see, you can now get a very high degree of magnification, and you can see why you can get very close at 16mm. There is a pretty significant difference in the amount of magnification at 16mm versus what you get at 35mm. That ability to get close and to really have high magnification allows you more potential to just take different types of shots, ones where you can actually blur out a background despite this being a wide angle zoom lens. So as we come to expect from the modern G Master designs, this lens is very well executed. They managed to make it very feature rich while also reducing the size and the weight, and that's a pretty impressive achievement. Autofocus is similarly improved, where we had two focus motors, not as good as the current motors either, but two focus motors in the first generation lens. We now have quad. That's four extreme dynamic XD linear motors here. And autofocus is everything that you could ask for. It is completely silent even when I put my ear up next to it. It is extremely fast, fast enough that it's designed to work with either high-speed bursts like on the Alpha 1 or the A9 III, but also if you're shooting video at 4K 120, it's going to keep up with that action and allow you to have just that brilliantly, just perfect autofocus. You can see in my test that focus transitions are essentially they're instantaneous. You just go from one subject to another with no spooling or lead up, no settling. It just, boom, one to the other, moves very, very quickly. It also does a good job of tracking the eye. And one thing that I do note that Sony does really well at this point is that when you look at shots, say the shot of Nala, you can see that the focus is actually on the iris. It's not on the, the eyelash. It's not on the eyelid. It's on the iris itself. And that is just beautifully executed. Now on the video side of things, I found that video focus pulls were really well executed. They are smooth and confident. There's no visible steps. There's no settling or pulsing or anything like that. And while there's obviously tons of focus speed available in the focus motors, Sony has damped it to the way where there still, I think, is a reasonable cinematic quality, even though the transitions are fairly quick. You'll also see that focus breathing is very low, not an issue at all. And of course, with the appropriate Sony bodies, you can minimize that even further with the focus breathing compensation. And you'll be able to do that with very minimal crop because there's just not a whole lot there to begin with. I also found that my hand test was just perfect. The transitions back and forth between the hand to the eye, you can see that they're confident, they happen quickly, there's no hesitation or lag before focus begins. It just does the job, and because there's low focus breathing, there's nothing abrupt or jarring in that transition between those two focus points. I also found, just in shooting a little bit of basketball action, that you can see that focus has no problem keeping up with the subjects. Helps, of course, that depth of field is so big with wide-angle lenses, but nonetheless, there's no jumping around, nothing discordant. You just got the action captured the way that you would want. So autofocus is excellent here. Similarly, image quality is improved and is excellent. You can see that the MTF charts are really fantastic. I don't know that I've hardly seen a sharper center and mid-frame performance from a wide-angle lens of any kind before, so that is really, really impressive. There is a significant improvement at 35mm in particular compared to the first generation lens. Now, here's the quick breakdown of optical performance, and you can get the deep dive following the summation here. There is some complex barrel distortion at 16mm. At 24mm in the middle of the zoom range, there's basically no distortion. There is a bit of pincushion distortion, though nothing significant on the telephoto end. Vignette is pretty well controlled all throughout the zoom range, in particular after 16mm, and by the time you get to 35mm, there's basically only about a stop of vignette there, so nothing significant. I also found that longitudinal and lateral chromatic aberrations are essentially perfectly controlled. This shot of these kind of dried, winterized plants shows just how precise focus is, but also that there's just no fringing that's marring the edges. And you can see also that at the edges of my test chart, there are no lateral chromatic aberrations there. Resolution at 16 millimeters is pretty much perfect all across the frame. Very, very high levels everywhere that you look. You will find that performance is close, maybe not 100% there, but probably 98% there at both 20 and 24 millimeters. Very slightly softer at 28 millimeters with a little bit of a rebound at 35 millimeters. However, in the center of the frame in particular, when I'm doing up close shots, I was really impressed by how sharp the lens was at 35 millimeters. You'll also find, because you can get close and blur things out, that the bokeh quality is pretty decent from the lens for a wide angle zoom. I also found that there was good geometry with specular highlights, that there's very little deformation. You can see at the top of this image, it stays quite circular right close to the edge. Flare resistance was essentially flawless. I didn't see any kind of loss of contrast, no ghosting artifacts. It just did a great job. And similarly, I also found that chroma performance was quite good, with no real chroma smear in the corners of the frame when I shot the night sky. In summation, this is the best and most consistent wide-angle zoom that I've tested since the 12 to 24 millimeter f2.8. Unlike that lens, however, this lens is smaller and cheaper and a little bit less extreme. Not everyone needs something going as wide as 12 millimeters. So, this lens is a little bit more conventional. You can use screw-on filters, all of that. And so if you're looking for just a really, really good wide-angle zoom, this is going to be it. It is very expensive at $2,300 US, so there are cheaper alternatives, but essentially this is the lens to get if you want the absolute best. And if you're a person that is completing a new trinity of zoom lenses and you've got the 24 to 70 and the 70 to 200, this is a perfect complement to those lenses. It is a professional grade lens for those who want the very best. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can get more information by taking a look at my text review. There's an image gallery there, along with the typical buying links if you'd like to purchase one. Now, if you want a deeper dive into the optical performance, stay with me for our image quality breakdown.
So our examination starts off with what is basically about the only optical flaw that I can come up with, and that is that there is some complex barrel distortion at 16 millimeters. You can see if I try to just manually correct it inside here and get the line straight, I end up warping the edges of the frame. Fortunately, the correction profile does a much better job, but we have got a plus 24 to correct to this degree, and then a plus 33 in vignette. So just a little over a stop of vignette in the corner, vignette being pretty much a non-issue. Now, fortunately, the correction profile does a much cleaner job in dealing with that distortion. It's not perfect, but you can see it does quite a good job. Now, at 24 millimeters, there's basically no distortion to correct and only a minimal amount of vignette, about one stop in the corner. Using about a little over plus 30 is plenty to correct that, as you can see here. By 35 millimeters, we have a little bit of pincushion distortion, a -4 to correct, but vignette is at its lowest point, basically less than one stop in the corners, so completely a non-issue. I believe that this image does a great job of showing how minimal the longitudinal chromatic aberration is. You can see there's lots of potential for fringing here, but it's completely perfectly controlled. Thus, we have really, really sharp delineation at the edges, making for really great looking images. This image, I think it looks good on a global level, but when you pop into a pixel level here on a 61 megapixel sensor, you can really appreciate just how nice that is. Now, we've already commented on the geometry, how nice of that is on the bokeh, but if we take a look at this shot, we can see that there's lots of shiny surfaces here, no fringing on those, and then as we look towards the specular highlights, there is no fringing around them either. The only negative I can point to is a little bit of busyness, a little bit of what you might call an onion bokeh in the center of those specular highlights. Likewise, lateral chromatic aberrations are really well controlled. You can see here that in all of these transitions from black to white, here at the edge of the frame, there is no fringing to be seen there. So the strong control of aberration sets us up for the potential for a very strong contrast, very detailed performance. And here, even showing at 200% on 61 megapixels, we can see that that center is perfect. That contrast is off the charts. Detail is fantastic. Mid-frame similarly looks very, very strong. And as we come down towards the corners, we can see still at this point, we've got very high resolution. And then right towards the edge of the frame, only in maybe that last little bit is there any kind of drop off, but overall very, very strong performance. So for a bit of perspective, I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at the Viltrox 16mm F1.8, a lens I reviewed earlier in the year, but one that I was exceptionally impressed with and how well it held up. So here we can see, if we compare both of them at f2.8, there's no question that the GM lens is the winner in the center of the frame. It looks fabulous. And the Viltrox is very, very good, but the GM lens is better. Now in the mid frame, it's a little bit more of a toss-up. I would argue that maybe the Viltrox has very slightly more contrast. If we look down in this zone, however, I would say that the GM lens is a little bit better. Looking up into this area, definitely better for the GM, but if we go up to this corner, it's the Viltrox that looks better. We pop down to this side, and again, I would say particularly as you look towards the edge of the frame, the Viltrox is a little bit better. So what we're seeing is some definite give and take depending on where you look, with the corners, I would say, favoring the Viltrox lens. Now the GM lens is one of the very rare wide-angle lenses that can produce a credible landscape image right from f2.8. So you can see here that looking across the frame, this is 16 millimeters f2.8. That's a great looking image, and if we punch into a pixel level, you can see that the detail is amazing in the center of the frame, but looking over here, detail is also exceptional right off to the edge of the frame. Depth of field means that this front corner is not quite sharp, but as soon as we get into the place where the lens is in focus, we can see the detail and contrast just looks pristine. Now, when you start off at such a high level, there's only so much room for improvement. So what I'm primarily seeing as you stop down to f4 and f5.6 is you can see that contrast is a little bit better, mostly in the form of the brights being a little bit brighter. You're going to see maybe a little bit more improvement here in the mid frame and a little bit in the corners. But for the most part, we're already at such a high level, there's just not much more to ask for. So here's a real-world shot at f5.6, and you can see that basically anywhere you look in the frame, the detail is perfect. There's really no flaws to point to. Everything is just handled really exceptionally well. Contrast looks good. You can see the color saturation is really beautiful. The word pristine keeps coming to mind. It kind of suits the scene, but it also suits the image quality there. Image quality stays at an extremely high level through f8, but on this high resolution body, after that point, diffraction will slowly start to creep in to where by the time you get to our minimum aperture of f22, you can see the image has been significantly softened by the effects of diffraction. Now, if we compare 16 millimeters to 20 millimeters, we can see in the middle of the frame that there really hasn't been anything lost, that 20 millimeters looks every bit as good. In the mid frame, I would argue that 20 millimeters looks a hair better, but in the corners, there's an advantage for 16 millimeters. There's plenty of resolution, though. Even shooting at 20 millimeters here in the gym, I could, get shots under even more dim conditions, and everything just looks really, really great. Detail looks awesome. So I'm able to freeze motion there and get a shot even in the midst of a burst. It looks great. Now, if we move on and we take a look at 24 millimeters and then at 28 millimeters, we can see that at 24 millimeters, we're at a similarly high level to what we've seen. Just a very mild fade at 28 millimeters. It's close. It's just not quite as pristine. In the mid-frame, however, I would say that 28 millimeters looks every bit as good as 24 millimeters, but down in the corners, we can see that the lens isn't quite as sharp as what we've seen, and I would say in this mid-frame area that 24 millimeters shows a little bit more than what 28 millimeters does. Over here on the left side, roughly similar, but you can see just a little bit more contrast in the hair and some of the texture information here at 24 millimeters. A real-world shot in this range looks just fantastic, and as you can see as we pop in and look at our subject that we're focused on, detail is just intensely good, contrast is fantastic, just a very, very strong performance. So probably second only to 16 millimeter in importance is 35 millimeters. And we can see here in the middle of the frame that performance is still very strong. Not as exquisitely good as that 16 millimeters, but really, really impressive by any measure. Mid-frame similarly looks really, really excellent. It's only when you get down towards the corners that you could see a little bit more of a drop off than what we did at 16 millimeters. Now this shot of Nala is 35 millimeters F2.8. We talked about it earlier in terms of the context of focus, but I wanted to give you a look at just how exquisite the detail is here when we are focused in. And, it's not only is focus nailed, but there is just great contrast and detail shown there. And in this area where you're seeing the reflection in her eye of myself and the window light behind, you'll see that there's no fringing in there. It looks just perfect. So likewise, the high degree of magnification you can achieve can allow you to really, really blur out a background, as you can see here. Now, obviously, that's only going to happen at 35 millimeters f2.8 and when you are near minimum focus distance. However, going out a little bit further and so a little less advantageous, you can see here with a busier background, there is some edging that is there, but overall the scene is relatively soft. And here in this shot, there is a little bit of outlining of some of the specular highlights. But overall, I would say the quality of the blur is relatively soft there. And again, as you punch in, you can see there's just a great amount of detail and contrast in these textures here. Now finally, if we look at the overall flare resistance, you can see that wide open, panning back and forth, there's basically nothing to see. There's no flare artifacts, no loss of contrast. And if we switch to a small aperture about f11, we can see that, again, it still is retaining quite strong contrast and very minimal flare artifacts against a bright sun.
All right, well, if you've made it all the way through the image quality breakdown, thanks for staying tuned to the very end. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.